Venice stands at a key crossroads between East and West. It's a nexus of commerce and the entry point for knowledge and trade and art from Asia. Marco Polo was, after all, a Venetian merchant, and Renaissance Venice was incredibly diverse demographically and socially. It was multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural. Last time, we zoomed out from Florence and Flanders to consider a broader view of Europe as a network of states and styles in constant flux. And although we saw the Flemish-inspired work of Cosimo Tura at the northern Italian court of Ferrara, we haven't really discussed the Renaissance in northern Italy, and particularly in Venice. This episode is dedicated to that discussion. Perhaps the most important connection that Venice held was to Constantinople, previously Byzantium and now Istanbul. Constantinople was a vital link between Europe and Asia, a meeting of trade routes and a trove of opportunity. If you have the pleasure of visiting Venice today, you'll see that it's not too different from how it looked here in the Baroque era, and also not too different from how it was in the 1470s, when this painting was made. It's made by the most famous artist there at the time, Gentile Bellini, and it's a work of art showing another work of art. The imposing object we see in the center of this image is a Byzantine object. It's a reliquary that's said to hold fragments of the true cross, the cross on which Christ was crucified. In 1453, the Orthodox Byzantine Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, fell to the Muslim Ottoman Empire. That's important to the story here because this man in profile, the Cardinal Gian Bessarion, was originally a Greek Orthodox archbishop who moved to Venice after the conquest in 1453. And he eventually donated this Byzantine icon to a confraternity or religious society, two of whose members are shown in white robes here. Confraternities, called scuole, served important philanthropic causes in Venice. Gentile Bellini was then tapped to produce this door panel to protect the reliquary, which still exists as exquisite evidence of the interaction between Venice and Byzantium. Now, Venice had a significant encounter with Constantinople 250 years before the Bessarion reliquary's arrival. The Fourth Crusade of 1202-4 was one of many failed efforts by Christians to reclaim Jerusalem, the Holy Land, from Muslim rule. Most of its participants were Venetians, but they actually never reached the Holy Land at all. Instead, they exploited the weakness of the then declining Byzantine Empire and sacked Constantinople. They massacred its residents and looted its art, bringing Greco-Roman and Byzantine artifacts back to Venice, where then they inspired generations of Italian artists. Greek Byzantine artists had also began moving to Italy, seeing as their own empire was in disarray. So it's no secret that Byzantine art laid the foundations for early Italian and particularly early Venetian Renaissance art. This delicate image by the Venetian Niccolò Brancaleone is more than a painting. It's an icon, a holy object meant to be venerated, prayed to, held under candlelight, intimately interacted with. Icons held divine power. Its surface is now much damaged, but the high definition, stylized figures and anatomy, and also calm solemnity reveals the Byzantine influence underlying Bronchialean's style. What's so intriguing about this artist is that he's documented at the Ethiopian court by the 1480s. Now, medieval Ethiopia was an Orthodox Christian kingdom with strong artistic ties to the Byzantine Empire. To Europeans, it was one of the better known places in Africa. So Bronchialean brings his Venetian/Byzantine style to Ethiopia, where the court artists there then became inspired and copied his work, driving further stylistic diffusion. This diptych is probably from 15th century Ethiopia. It's said to be the copy of an icon by Bronchialean, and indeed the compositions are very similar, but the approach to figure here is distinctly Ethiopian. We see St. George, a knight who represents the triumph of good over evil, and by extension, the triumph of Christianity. He's charging toward the Virgin and Child, taking on a protective role, and their gazes meet. We're reminded of his martyrdom, too, because by legend, he's dismembered into 365 pieces in battle. In the Ethiopian tradition, it's common to see St. George together with the Virgin Mary because they shared a feast day, according to the Ethiopic Book of Saints, the Senkasar. And as a copy after Bronchialean, this diptych is a beautiful reminder of the artistic threads inextricably linking Venice, Ethiopia, and Byzantium. So with this network in mind, let's now trace the evolution of Venetian Renaissance painting into the late 15th century, and we'll start in the 1430s with the leading painter Giambono. What makes Giambono's devotional work stand out is emotionalism. This marvelous little panel retains its original Gothic frame. It's at once a morbid and meditative picture, showing Christ as the man of sorrows. We can see the wounds of his crucifixion. Giambono has actually added relief to the blood and the crown of thorns. They project out of the panel. You can touch them and feel them. So appreciating this work, praying to it, would have been a multi-sensory experience cultivating physical connection between the image and the beholder. But the decorative ornamentation of the robes and the gold in the background betray Giambono's international Gothic roots, and in fact we can see a phoenix highlighted in gold to either side of Christ's head, reminding us of his resurrection. It's this spirit of innovation and experimentation upon international Gothic foundations, like we saw in episode 1, that set the stage for the Renaissance in Venice. By the mid-15th century, painters were mixing the Venetian Gothic vocabulary with artistic dialects from other Italian courts. Among them is Jacopo Bellini, who, like Pisanello, had worked for the Este in Ferrara, and we're so lucky that his sketchbook has survived. What can we gather from these precious folios? Well, for one, that Jacopo's interested in naturalism. He and Pisanello are kindred spirits in that way, and Jacopo is very sensitive to the psychology of these animals. This lion looks slightly irritated. Is it hunger or a bad hunt? And here we see the hunt in action, and it reminds me so much of Henri Rousseau's 1905 picture of a lion sinking its teeth into an antelope. St. George slays the dragon in this scene with such vitality and animation. I imagine him in motion, and even without color, this drawing is brimming with energy. And this is Bellini's version of the Vision of St. Eustace. I have to wonder whether he saw Pisanello's treatment of the same subject in Ferrara. Back in Venice, Jacopo Bellini established a bustling workshop where he taught his two sons, Gentile and the younger Giovanni, to follow in his footsteps as painters. He really hoped to establish a new dynasty of Venetian painting. Gentile was the one who painted Cardinal Bessarion with the Reliquary, so Jacopo has this kind of dynastic plan in mind when he meets a budding young artist named Andrea Mantegna in the nearby university city of Padua. Mantegna's talent instantly catches Jacopo's attention, and of course, he wants to rope Mantegna into the Bellini artistic dynasty, both to grow its fame and to turn a gifted competitor into an ally. It just so happened that Jacopo had a daughter, Nicolosia. So he arranges for Nicolosia to marry Mantegna. They agree and wed in 1454, and the marriage would last until Nicolosia's death, so at least some love must have blossomed out of this exploitative arrangement. 1 year later, in 1455, Mantegna paints this scene. This is the moment when Joseph and Mary carry the newborn Christ to be purified and circumcised in the temple at Jerusalem, and they meet Simeon, a man who recognizes the child as Jesus the Savior, as the Messiah. It's a tender picture with muted tones and dim lighting. You can see some hesitation in Mary as Simeon, this old man, reaches for the Christ child. It's her maternal instinct to be cautious and protective. But there are two other figures here looking to the left out of the frame, one at far left and another at far right, in anachronistic dress. It's hard not to see this as Mantegna himself and his new wife, Nicolosia Bellini. In fact, this could be a picture commemorating their marriage and the birth of their first child. Notice the rigid, almost sculptural austerity of Mantegna's figures, and that's due to his study of Roman sculpture in Padua, but also because of Donatello's stay in Padua. Mantegna's paintings are very much indebted to sculpture. Well, remember how Jacopo Bellini has two sons, Gentile and Giovanni? Giovanni Bellini paints a nearly identical version of the presentation some years after Mantegna, and I'm inclined to think the occasion was another family event. Giovanni's figures appear softer than Mantegna's more austere and sculptural ones. Identifying them in this picture is a little bit of a guessing game, but following Mantegna's example, one of these men must be Giovanni Bellini himself. From comparison with his self-portrait, he's likely the rightmost figure. Who would it make sense to position next to him? Well, one of his brothers, either Mantegna, his new brother-in-law, or Gentile. Across the scene, there's a woman who closely resembles Mantegna's Nicolosia. Now, Giovanni Bellini never married, so it's been suggested that next to Nicolosia could be his mother, Anna. Bellini has also removed the halos and situated the figures next to a marble railing that makes the space feel more accessible and open than Mantegna's painted frame, which almost closes off the scene from us. Bellini's painting stylistically is the more progressive one. Jacopo envisioned a dialogue between his own sons and the talented Mantegna, and he wouldn't be disappointed, as I think these two paintings show, because Giovanni Bellini's interest in Mantegna's work and vice versa would continue for the rest of their careers. Their artistic relationship was special in that it extended beyond the paintings themselves. It was personal and deeply familial, a theme that reveals, especially for Mantegna, a more private, intimate side to their work. To explore this brotherhood some more, I want to show you this early work by Mantegna made in his 20s. This scene takes place right after the Last Supper, when Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane outside Jerusalem on the eve of his crucifixion, accompanied by 3 sleeping apostles, his followers. Jesus prays atop a rock that looks almost like an altar, and he's met with 5 little winged angels called putti, one of whom holds a cross that foreshadows his fate. The apostles are deep in sleep with their mouths open, maybe snoring, and farther away, a procession of soldiers is coming to arrest Jesus for blasphemy, led by Judas, a disciple of Jesus who's bribed into betraying him. Although Mantegna reminds us that Judas later hangs himself on a fig tree filled with regret, because we see this fig that sprouted from the rock, lodging itself on a ridge. Blocking Judas's path are a group of rabbits known for rapidly multiplying and therefore symbolic of fertility and fecundity and of new life, referencing Christ's resurrection. And we're on to something here because the running water in the stream recalls Christ's baptism, while the dead tree and perched vulture on the other side suggests his forthcoming death on the cross. So Mantegna has packed into this scene all the major events of Christ's life. Far in the distance, at the foot of these spectacular rock formations, we see Jerusalem. It looks almost like a Roman city. It includes an amphitheater and a monumental column, but its buildings are topped with crescent moons, symbols of Islam, and these reflect Jerusalem in the 1450s, being a city under Mamluk control. 5 years later, Bellini quotes Mantegna's Agony in the Garden in his own take on the subject. Bellini's composition mirrors Mantegna's. It transposes elements in Mantegna's. Christ, still praying at an altar-like stone, now faces to our right, met in his prayer by a puto, holding not the instruments of his passion, but a chalice linked to his blood, and therefore nonetheless suggestive of his crucifixion. The 3 apostles are still asleep, but their poses are more awkward and unnatural, with a careful attempt at foreshortening, not as convincing as Mantegna's though. The rock formation takes on this strange curvilinear form, and the portrayal of spatial recession is a little bit immature. Venetian painters aren't as big on linear perspective as were their Florentine counterparts. But what's notable about Bellini's version is the wonderful use of light. He's cast a spotlight on Christ in the panel of rock on which he kneels. It's the light of dawn, a welcoming light, offering a glimmer of hope in a moment of agitation. The pink shade of sunrise is skillfully blended with the dark blue-gray of the receding twilight clouds, illuminating them, producing a silver lining. The puto holding the chalice is silvery, translucent, intimating that this is a visit by a divinity from another world. It's for this use of light and color that will earn Giovanni Bellini his long-lasting fame. You might know of the Bellini cocktail. Now you know the artist it honors. All this while, Mantegna, trained in Padua, has a job offer nagging at him. Ludovico Gonzaga, the Marquis or ruler of Mantua, a city sandwiched between Milan and Venice, has been persuading Mantegna to become his court painter for years. The hard part of the decision was that Mantua wasn't particularly known as a center for the arts, so it wasn't easy for Ludovico to attract talent in the first place, but he offered eventually so much money that in 1460 Mantegna couldn't refuse any longer. And it would be at Mantua that Mantegna completed a formidable cycle of frescoes in the Gonzaga Palace, specifically in the bridal chamber, in a reception room called the Camera degli Sposi. Every wall contains gems, and Mantegna has even included a hidden self-portrait among it all. One wall shows the Gonzaga court as a family portrait, honoring his patrons, the Marquis and Marchioness of Mantua. This is already a testament to his mastery of portraiture, but the true pièce de résistance in the room is the ceiling. Here, Mantegna shows off all of his skill at once, all of his technique, all his knowledge of classical architecture and mastery of linear perspective, which he has studied intensively, in part from Donatello. He wants to trick your eye. It's a masterwork of trompe-l'œil in the truest sense. He convinces you that his vaulted ceiling and most impressively his oculus or open dome are real, when it's all fiction. For a moment, with some imagination, they do seem unquestionably real. Mantegna achieves this effect using techniques collectively called di sotto in su, or seen from below. Among them, foreshortening to the point where figures seemingly project out of the picture plane. Putti stand riskily on the ridge of the dome's support. It's almost slightly worrying to see them just barely clinging to the sides. A peacock, symbolic of the resurrection and the afterlife, ventures toward the opening in the oculus, perhaps to stare down at us. The optical illusion here is absolutely astounding. The surrounding ceiling contains portrait medallions of the first 8 Roman emperors, really just reflecting the desire of the Mantuan court to recreate the glory of that ancient empire. If this is Mantegna's first masterpiece, then his resounding magnum opus is a series of 9 canvases that embody Renaissance classicism. The triumphs of Caesar, today at Hampton Court Palace, were also painted for the Gonzaga. They situate us directly in ancient Rome, where we bear witness to the magnificent processions celebrating General Julius Caesar's victory in the Gallic Wars of the 50s BCE. Mantegna bases his representation on ancient Roman writings, and the arrangement of figures here indeed closely resembles the reliefs on a Roman frieze. We see picture bearers, people carrying all manner of spoils and booty from war, some riding elephants, vases, of which there were many in the Gonzaga collection of Roman antiquities, trumpeters, prisoners of war, and finally we see the legendary Julius Caesar himself enthroned. It was customary by this point in Italian history for the ruling class to receive a humanist education if they wanted to be competitive culturally with other courts like that of the Medici. The art they commissioned naturally reflected that education. It allowed dukes and princesses to show off their wealth and scholarship and knowledge of classical civilization. The aim of a court artist, then, was to satisfy that demanding taste, and this daunting task actually aligned well with Mantegna's personality. Mantegna wanted glamour. He was an artist who would show off his technical virtuosity at every opportunity. The triumphs are colossal paintings, each one almost 3 by 3 meters, and there are 2 points of interest about the medium Mantegna uses here. Firstly, instead of wood panel, Mantegna uses canvas as a support, a shift from wood that we'll eventually see throughout Europe. Canvases are fabrics made from the same material as sailcloth for boats and ships, commonly hemp. Venice was, of course, known for its navy and maritime trade. It was a city of boats and ships. So it makes sense that canvas is first popularized in northern Italian painting from near Venice. Secondly, for his paint, Mantegna uses glue size, where the binding agent for pigments is animal glue rather than egg yolk or linseed oil. Animal glue is basically processed connective tissue. It's an incredibly delicate technique, explaining the damage and paint loss these pictures have sustained. But imagine these grand canvases in fresh, gleaming color. It's not hard to see, then, why they cement Mantegna's place among the great masters of the European Renaissance. In 1490, Marquis of Mantua Francesco Gonzaga, Ludovico's grandson, married Isabella d'Este, who was from the equally humanist Este family in Ferrara. This profile was painted by Leonardo when he visited Mantua, and Isabella was a greatly admired scholar of the classics, a gifted musician, lute player, a dancer, a fashion icon, and a politician who ruled as a regent for her son after Francesco died. She was the Renaissance woman. She was also a leading patron and collector of the arts. This fabulous picture is one of my favorites of all time. It was commissioned from Mantegna for Isabella's studiolo, or private study. There's so much commotion here, so much animation, but Mantegna helps us interpret it with all of these Latin inscriptions. Perhaps the thesis of the painting is found inscribed on the riverbank. Quote, "Take away idleness, and Cupid's bow is broken," quoted from a poem by the ancient Roman writer Ovid. Mantegna paints a personification of idleness, which are these rather ugly looking figures, being evicted from this garden, along with other vices such as ingratitude, ignorance, and avarice or greed, all of whom he has labeled on their headbands. We also see among their ranks a centaur, seen as savage and barbaric, and several satyrs, which are associated with lust and drunken revelry. Driving all of them away is this valiant warrior, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, and urging her on is this tree woman, Daphne, a nymph associated with fresh water and purity. It's such an innovative scene without precedent in all of Renaissance painting, and the way Mantegna plays with the light shining in from the right is just beautiful. I absolutely love Cupid with his bow, looking absolutely distraught as he flies off with a moth's wings. There are also owl-headed putti. Owls were viewed as unclean. Overall, this is the psychomachia, the battle between virtue and vice for control over the soul, with virtue here emerging victorious, an outcome Isabella d'Este certainly strove to achieve. Mantegna also worked with printmakers who translated designs into engravings and helped disseminate them, popularizing them. Altogether, this flurry of activity invigorated the Mantuan art scene, bringing this court to the forefront of Renaissance art making. And of course, these activities weren't limited to painting. This bronze roundel by Gianmarco Cavalli, some 45 centimeters in diameter, is the largest of its kind to survive from the Italian Renaissance, and it really typifies the visual culture at the height of classical revival in Mantua. We see several deities depicted here from Roman mythology, but even if we didn't recognize their attributes, the inscription tells us Venus, Mars, and Love rejoice. Vulcan, you labor. So see if you can reconstruct the narrative here. On the left, we see Venus, the goddess of love, with her lover Mars, the god of war. Venus holds their son, Cupid, the god of love and of romantic attraction. But Cupid is the product of an extramarital affair because Venus is actually married to Vulcan, who's on the right here. Vulcan is the god of fire, who's a blacksmith. So while Venus and Mars are exchanging this lovely romantic moment, Vulcan is forging away, fashioning Mars's helmet. And then you have these wonderful little mischievous putti at the bottom. Notice Cupid is missing something, his wings. And that's because they're on Vulcan's workbench. He's yet to finish forging them. So Cupid is kind of throwing Vulcan this playfully shady look. But there are deeper layers of allegorical meaning here. Notice Venus's right hand. What's she doing? She's grasping Mars's shield. She looks as if she's restraining him from his violent, belligerent inclinations. Could she represent Isabella d'Este, who was trying to maintain the peace at a time when Italy was plunging once again in a war in the late 1490s? Francesco Gonzaga was a condottiere working for Venice at this time, a mercenary, and he was gone so regularly that Isabella ruled as regent in his place. I can't help but think Isabella would have identified with Cavalli's Venus. Look also at Mars's helmet. It's a leaping horse. The name Cavalli means horses, and in a way this is a signature. But of course, Cavalli's a sculptor, he's a goldsmith. So is he identifying himself with Vulcan here, elevating his own status by likening himself to a god? His technique certainly is divine, breathtaking. That delicate gilding, that tangible muscularity, the psychological depth, the symbolic complexity. This Roundel proudly proclaims the level of erudition and classical scholarship blossoming in Mantua in the late 15th century. So that's Mantegna's trajectory in Venice and Mantua, but what about Giovanni Bellini? Well, he stays in metropolitan Venice with his brother Gentile, and the differences in the subjects painted by Mantegna and Bellini speak to the different careers of the court painter and the city painter. In the city, artists could expect a more diverse clientele, but also a larger volume of mundane commissions like this Madonna and Child. So as a result, Giovanni Bellini found himself working on portraits, private devotional pictures, and public altarpieces most of the time, as opposed to Mantegna's erudite classical mythologies. Already in Bellini's Agony in the Garden, we saw his intense interest in light effects and achieving them by manipulating color, by using color gradients to achieve definition rather than using concrete line. This light and color-centered approach to painting would become known as colore, as opposed to the Florentine preference for line and design, something we'll explore next episode called disegno. We see colore here in the poetic landscape of Bellini's Christ Blessing, illuminated by the rosy glow of dawn. And that's fitting because this is the resurrected Christ. Look at those two rabbits again. Remember the symbolic meaning of rabbits from the Agony of the Garden? Fertility and new life, thus the resurrection. So we have this juxtaposition with the dead tree reminding us of the crucifixion, but these other elements suggesting Christ's eventual triumph. On the road behind him are also the three Marys, the women who noticed that Christ's tomb was empty. But as you let your eyes wander around the composition, notice the brightness at far right, where the bell tower of a church is so conspicuously placed. Bellini directs us from the resurrection in the foreground to the church in the background, suggesting prayer and devotion to Christ are the way to achieve salvation. Notice the medium of this painting. Oil. Oil paint was now in use in Venice, having been brought there by Antonello da Messina from last episode, and oil lends itself to a certain luminosity unachievable with tempera alone, accentuating Bellini's masterful light effects. Even in modeling Christ's anatomy, Bellini doesn't use line. Rather, he uses light and shadow to suggest depth and form. Again, signature colore. The shadow of Christ's blessing hand even calls attention to his wounds, the poeticism of light, therefore becoming a narrative device. Again, there's a softness and approachability that's not found in Mantegna's sculptural figures. For more on Venetian colore, watch Season 1, Episode 2, which features Giovanni Bellini's Ecstasy of St. Francis and his portrait of the Venetian Doge. Images like Christ's blessing are practical aids in devotion, almost the Renaissance analog of Byzantine icons, and they're more representative of typical Renaissance commissions than Mantegna's complex allegories. The fact is that classical revival and humanism were high and mighty ideas inaccessible to the great majority of the European population who were illiterate. It's hard to imagine Italian commoners caring very much at all about classical architectural settings or perfect linear perspective in painting. We talk about these ideas, but these were noble ideals, elevated, extolled, and appreciated by the aristocracy. Metropolitan Venice in the 1480s and 90s was a bustling center of cultural activity. And beyond Mantegna and Bellini, I'll now attempt to contextualize it further with two slight digressions, the first of which focuses on this beaker, which exemplifies the glass craftsmanship for which Venice was and still is so well known. The coat of arms on this object reveals it was made for a family from Nuremberg in Germany. The other images show St. Michael slaying the devil and St. Catherine the Alexandria, and these are probably the namesake saints, meaning somebody from the family was named Michael and another was named Catherine. And indeed, we do find a Michael in this family. In fact, he was the mayor of Nuremberg who just so happened to marry a Catherine in 1495. So we put two and two together. It follows that the beaker was likely commissioned for that very occasion. So even in the 15th century, Venetian glass was luxurious and had an international clientele, just like it still does. My second digression spotlights a lesser-known artist whom I think deserves more attention. His name is Carpaccio, and his paintings capture Venice's vigor and cosmopolitan character. It's ironic because the narrative cycle I'm showing you isn't supposed to take in Venice. The story itself takes place elsewhere, but Carpaccio transposes the 5th century events it describes into 15th century Venice to make it more accessible to its contemporary audience. The cycle illustrates the life of Saint Ursula, made for a confraternity scuole dedicated to the saint. Ursula is a princess from Brittany in modern France, and there was a pagan English prince, the story went, who came to her father's court to ask for her hand in marriage. That's what we see here. We see the prince and his posse of ambassadors in this massive first canvas, nearly 6 meters wide, against the anachronistic backdrop of a Renaissance Venetian seaport. The man in red at lower left breaks fourth wall. He gazes at us almost like a narrator in a play, heightening the theatricality of the scene. Ursula is shown at right in her bedroom with her father, and I love the gold ground Madonna and Child that hangs above them. It reveals to us she's very devout. She doesn't want to marry a pagan prince. And she doesn't meet him, in fact, until the fourth canvas, which again takes a Venetian harbor as its setting. Her terms for the marriage is that A, the prince will convert to Christianity, and B, together they'll embark on a pilgrimage to Rome, her twist on the honeymoon. But Carpaccio foreshadows that their plan won't work out in the sixth of the series, where we see Ursula alone asleep in a beautiful Venetian bedroom bathed in a dreamlike luminosity. An angel at the door informs her that she'll become a martyr, that she won't survive her upcoming journey with the prince to Rome. But the trip goes ahead, and Ursula brings along a group of 11,000 virgin women after whom Columbus named the Virgin Islands. They do reach Rome, but on the way back, Ursula's entourage stops at Cologne. Now, Ursula lived in the 5th century when Cologne was under attack by the Huns. That's the military action in the background. But again, Carpaccio transposes the situation into contemporary context, and the flags, the enemy depicted here, are not the Huns, but the Ottomans. Again, making it more relevant to the everyday 15th century Venetian. In either case, religious conflict ensues, and Ursula's band of virgins is beheaded en masse while she's fatally shot with an arrow. The angel's message comes true. The final canvases show Ursula's funeral and, eventually, her ascension. A very unhappy ending. By chronicling her story against a Venetian social and political backdrop, Carpaccio gives Ursula's marriage and martyrdom a heightened visual immediacy, something that would have made the cycle more digestible and relatable for Venetians who saw it. I show the St. Ursula cycle also because its reflection of tense Venetian-Ottoman relations is important to the historical and art historical narrative. And this conflict plays an especially important role in the life of the third brother we'll discuss, Gentile Bellini, from the beginning of the episode. Gentile's fame actually overshadowed that of his brother Giovanni during their lifetimes. Gentile was official portraitist, in fact, to the doges or rulers of Venice. But because he wasn't as stylistically progressive as Giovanni, he falls out of fashion by the 16th century. Gentile's career was very much shaped by Venetian politics. 1463 saw the beginning of a 16-year struggle between the Venetian Republic and the Ottoman Empire for territorial control. Venice owned land in the Balkans, which it called the Stato da Mar, State of the Sea, a strategic location for defense and commerce. And Venice stationed an impressive navy there, but felt threatened by Ottoman expansion in the 1450s. The Ottoman-Venetian War ensued. Now, the result of the war was a net loss for Venice, but because Venice had a powerful trading partner in the Ottoman Empire, it was in its best interest to resolve this conflict as quickly as possible. The Ottoman Sultan at the time was Mehmed II, aptly called Mehmed the Conqueror. He had a humanist education and became quite interested in classical culture and later Renaissance culture. Mehmed saw his empire as a continuation of Byzantium and Rome. He was keen on preserving cultural connections with Western Europe. So when the war ended, he requested that Venice send its most talented artist to Constantinople to paint his portrait. Now, portraiture is discouraged in Islam, lest it lead to idolatry. But Mehmed applied this rule only in religious contexts, and Venice, eager to restore peaceful relations, quickly sent Gentile Bellini, its best portrait painter, to his court. We do know that from court records, the Sultan developed quite a close and friendly relationship with Gentile, and that he adored Gentile's artistic talent. And he did, of course, have Gentile paint this wonderful portrait. The Sultan is shown here in 3/4, framed by a classical arch suiting his humanist tastes. Below him, an opulent cloth punctuated by precious gems and a crown of small pearls. To either side are 3 crowns, suggestive of the vastness of his territories, which span the Balkan and Anatolian peninsulas, roughly modern-day Greece and Turkey. Inscriptions on the marble deem him to be Victor Orbis, conqueror of the world. And with this portrait, Gentile's diplomatic mission was complete. In addition to the Sultan's portrait, Gentile leaves us an intriguing body of work from his time in Constantinople. In this delicate likeness of an Ottoman scribe, we can see every fold of his turban. His robe is adorned with gold, with colorful silk textiles underneath. He's attentively writing and takes no notice of us. He's painted in the style of a Persian miniature, but the inscription tells us that this was done by a European artist. See that crease running along the center? It means that it was folded and probably part of an album with other loose leaf studies, which were studied by Ottoman court painters too. Now, with the successful diplomatic resolution that Gentile indirectly helped engineer, trade between Venice and Constantinople reached new heights by the end of the 15th century. All manner of Asian objects began pouring into Italy, inspiring European artists to study and emulate these curios. This was the Venice to which Gentile returned in 1480 after his year-long sojourn at the Ottoman court, and he too begins featuring new cultural elements in his paintings. Orientalism was not a new phenomenon in Renaissance painting. Mamluk textiles had been imported for many decades. We see pseudo-Kufic script, for example, in Gentile da Fabriano's Adoration from episode 1. Trade between Venice and the East had evidently thrived for centuries, but Gentile has the distinction of physically traveling to Anatolia, modern Turkey, where he saw, for one, so-called Oriental carpets in person, later including them in works such as this altarpiece. At the foot of the Virgin and Child lies a late 15th century Anatolian carpet with the unique motif of a keyhole on one end and a pointed design on the other. The pointed end of this keyhole type carpet, which is at the bottom end, is visible in Gentile's painting. And this marks the beginning of a new wave of Orientalism that continues in northern Italy into the 16th century. By the dawn of that new century, Gentile is in his mid-70s. His last Venetian commission began in 1504, is this magnificent mural for a confraternity. It shows an event from the 1st century CE, St. Mark delivering a sermon in the Egyptian city of Alexandria. He speaks before a domed structure that synthesizes architectural styles from Anatolia and the Levant, including Ottoman domes and Mamluk arches, elements Gentile must have seen in Constantinople. In the background cityscape, we see identifiable structures located in Alexandria and Cairo, and so it's very possible that at some point during his year abroad, Gentile might have personally visited Egypt, which was then under Mamluk control. Listening to St. Mark are veiled women, cloaked in white, and men in turbans and bright-hued robes. Behind him stand the members of the Venetian confraternity who gave the commission, which may be later additions by Giovanni Bellini when Gentile died in 2007, leaving the mural unfinished. Most spectacular, I think, are the animals on the plaza behind the crowd. A one-humped camel, a two-humped camel, Arabian horses with equestrians, and a giraffe. This massive canvas spans almost 8 meters wide and is again done using oil, which is by this point the predominant medium of choice. And after Gentile's death, his workshop continued his tradition of setting works in the Levant, in the East, although many times inaccurately, as they had never physically visited. In this painting, for example, we see the governor of Damascus meeting a group of Venetian merchants. There are two curious deer in the foreground, which we know to be from the animal's imagination, because no animal of such appearance ever lived in the Levant. But the buildings in the back are relatively true to life. They're possibly based on Gentile's drawings. But Gentile's heyday and the period of dialogue between Giovanni and Mantegna, like all things, came to an end. Mantegna dies in 06, Gentile a year later. Giovanni Bellini is the only one of the three to live to see the near height of the Venetian High Renaissance, and he trains in his workshop the next generation of Venetian masters, Titian and Giorgione. We don't know exactly why or when Mantegna painted this iconic Lamentation, but I want to show it because Mantegna is reflecting on mortality here. This has to be one of the most poignant and visually striking works of Renaissance painting, the extreme foreshortening and the outpouring of emotion akin to what you would see in a Roger van der Weyden. We see a pallid, wounded, lifeless Christ. St. John the Baptist in a profil perdu, a lost profile showing us only the side of his wrinkled face. The Virgin Mary beside herself with a mother's grief. At first, you might think Christ is lying on a mattress, but look again. It's a block of marble, and you can just imagine how freezing that marble surface could be, which of course echoes the coldness of the palate. This is a funeral dirge, a requiem in orange and gray. In his final years, Mantegna obsessed over emulating marble sculpture in painting, using grisaille, grayscale, to mimic that medium. Similar in idea to what Roger van der Weyden is doing with the Duran Madonna, like we saw last episode. And Mantegna combines these elements with his love for the classics. We can also see influence from Donatello, which again reflects on Mantegna's Paduan training. This late work shows an episode of Roman history so obscure that it's the only such example of it in all of art history. It shows the portrait bust of the nature goddess Cybele entering the city of Rome, being greeted by a procession. And Mantegna probably intended this to resemble the decorative side panel of a Roman sarcophagus, judging from its oblong shape, which, combined with the esoteric subject matter, would have appealed greatly to the humanist elite. Now, the Cult of Cybele canvas is one in a series commissioned from Mantegna, but this was a commission he would never complete. He dies before he can. And so it's a beautiful full circle moment when his brother-in-law Giovanni Bellini steps in to help finish the task by emulating, for the first and only time, Mantegna's signature grisaille. In his metropolitan career, as I mentioned, Bellini rarely produced scenes from classical myth or history. Isabella d'Este had, in fact, implored Bellini to paint allegories for her, and he'd refused, perhaps recognizing that this was the domain of his brother-in-law, Mantegna. But he makes an exception here, honoring Mantegna's style after his death. Bellini's panel shows a prisoner of war being presented to a Roman general after his conquest of Carthage in the 3rd century BCE. This prisoner, this woman here, has a fiancé back home, and when she tells this to the enthroned General Scipio, he actually allows her to walk free out of sympathy and mercy, hence his continence or temperance. This is Giovanni Bellini's tribute to Mantegna, the conclusion to a lifetime of familial connection and artistic conversation that formed the cornerstone of the Venetian Renaissance. Next time, we'll recenter our focus on central Italy, fanning out from Florence to pick up where we left off with portraiture in the 3rd episode. In particular, we'll trace the development of anatomical rigor in late 15th century Tuscan painting, not only with respect to human anatomy, but also the anatomy of space, both pictorial space and the spatial conception of our universe. This includes the advent of cadaver dissection as a form of anatomical study, but also the phenomenon that painting became an extension of geometry, a means of mathematical expression. I hope to see you then. Thank you for watching A Narrative Art History of the Renaissance.